The insane truth about the Scammell 100-tonner. The truck, so powerful, it literally broke the roads. In 1929, a small British truck company built the largest lorry the world had ever seen. It could carry 100 tons. It needed 2 drivers. One sat in the front, the other sat 78 feet behind him, steering the back end by hand, connected to the front driver by telephone. The roads it drove on were not designed for anything close to this kind of weight, so the wheels sank through them, regularly. And the solution? Carry steel plates everywhere you go and build temporary roads as needed. Now, to understand why anyone would build something like this, you have to understand what Britain looked like in the late 1920s. The roads were, to put it gently, not great. Most country roads were still plain macadam, which is just broken stone pressed flat, with a slight hump in the middle to drain rainwater. Nothing bound it together except the weight of traffic packing it down over time. In towns, you might get cobblestones if you were lucky. Tarred macadam, the smooth, dark surface we think of when we picture a modern road, was only starting to appear in cities around 1905. It wouldn't reach most rural roads until well into the 1930s. Main roads were typically 30 to 35 feet wide. Country lanes were maybe 15 to 20. There were no motorways. Those wouldn't come until 1959, when the first section of the M1 opened and was treated like a national event. The idea of Britain's road network handling heavy motorized freight was still being figured out. Speed limits had been abolished entirely by the Road Traffic Act of 1930, which gives you a sense of the regulatory chaos of the era. Horse-drawn carts still shared the road with motor vehicles. Commercial trucks were often fitted with solid rubber tires. Steam wagons were still in widespread use. And into this landscape, someone decided to send a 130-ton vehicle across the Pennines. The weight limits that existed were inherited from the age of steam traction engines, patched together over decades without anyone imagining what the 20th century would demand. A typical commercial vehicle weighed 8 to 12 tons fully loaded. Bridges had weight restrictions, but enforcement was inconsistent. The entire infrastructure of Britain was built for horses, light carts, and the occasional steam wagon at 4 miles per hour, and that's the world someone wanted to send a 100-ton truck through. But here's the thing about heavy haulage. It doesn't care about reasonable. It exists because industry keeps making things too big to move by normal means. Somebody always has to figure it out. The specific problem in 1929 was steam locomotives. Kitson's, a well-established locomotive manufacturer based in Leeds, needed to transport out-of-gauge locomotives from their factory to Liverpool docks for export to overseas markets. These weren't small machines. They were enormous steel beasts, oddly proportioned, vastly overweight, and completely incapable of being driven to the port under their own power because the track gauges didn't match. The route from Leeds to Liverpool meant crossing the Pennines, the geological spine of northern England, steep gradients, narrow roads, tight corners, through stone-built villages. Absolutely nothing about this route was friendly to heavy transport. The contract for moving these locomotives belonged to Marston Road Services, or MRS, based on Lightbody Street in Liverpool. The company was run by Ernest Charles Marston, a man who'd been in the heavy haulage business long enough to understand both its possibilities and its limits. In 1929, the limits were significant. The largest loads were typically moved by teams of steam traction engines working together, crawling along at walking pace, each one adding its pulling power to the collective effort. 3, 4, sometimes 5 machines chained to one load. It was slow, expensive, complicated, and unreliable. Steam traction engines broke down. They needed water. They needed coal. They needed flat ground to operate efficiently, and the Pennines had precious little of that. What Marston wanted was elegantly simple. One vehicle, one load, point A to point B, done. He had a long-standing relationship with Scammell Lorries Limited, the specialist truck builder based at Tolpits Lane in Watford. Scammell was an unusual company. It had started as G. Scammell and Nephew, a Victorian wheelwright and coach-building business in Spitalfields, London's East End. George Scammell's family grew the business into servicing Foden steam wagons, then building their own vehicles after a customer named Edward Rudd imported a Knox tractor from America and suggested they build something similar. The First World War proved motorized transport worked, and by 1920, Scammell had their first articulated lorry. By 1922, they'd incorporated and moved to Watford. Their biggest product was the 25-ton machinery carrier, introduced in 1927. Marston wasn't asking for that. He was asking them to quadruple their capacity in 8 months, so naturally they said yes. The challenge fell to two men. Percy Garibaldi Hugh was Scammell's technical director and general manager, a founding figure of the company who'd been there since it incorporated it in 1922. Hugh was methodical, experienced, and understood road transport engineering better than almost anyone in Britain. Working alongside him was Oliver Danson North, born in 1887 in Willesden Green, who joined Scammell the same year. Before Scammell, North had worked with Ralph Lucas developing the North Lucas radial engine at the Robin Hood Engineering Works in Putney Vale. He was creative, technically brilliant, and by several accounts, eccentric. North would go on to design some of the most iconic British commercial vehicles ever built. The Scammell Pioneer, the legendary six-wheeled off-road tractor with its walking beam bogie and astonishing cross-country performance, which became the backbone of British Army tank transport in World War II. The Mechanical Horse, that peculiar three-wheeled delivery tractor with its automatic coupling system that could turn in less than its own length, which became a fixture of British postal, railway, and delivery operations for decades. Over 20,000 mechanical horses and their successors were built, along with more than 100,000 carriers. The man thought big, even when the vehicle was small. And crucially, North's designs made money. That mattered, because Scammell was never a wealthy company. They built expensive, low-volume specialist vehicles, and money was always tight. The Depression hit them hard. By 1934, the firm was in such poor financial shape that Watford Council helped out by ordering a pair of fire engines, and Shellmex injected capital, but demanded a management change that cost Colonel Scammell his position. North's genius was keeping them alive. What Hugh and North achieved over the next 8 months was staggering by any standard. 8 months. From initial inquiry to a finished working 100-ton capacity articulated lorry delivered to Marston Road Services on January 20th, 1930. Registration number KD9168. For context, Scammell's previous biggest vehicle carried 25 tons. They were jumping to 100. That's not an incremental improvement. That's a different category of engineering. And the confidence was apparently contagious. Scammell's sales ledger shows that the second 100-tonner was ordered by H.E. Coley Limited of Dartford, Kent, before work had even started on the first. Before a single rivet was driven, before anyone knew if the concept would actually function. Coley committed nearly £5,000 to a vehicle that existed only in Oliver North's head. In 1930, £5,000 was extraordinary money. A house might cost $300. A standard commercial truck was $400 or $500. The biggest Scammell vehicles, the Pioneers, cost $2,000. The Pioneer gun tractor, the most expensive thing in the catalog, was $2,800. Coley paid $4,900 for an unproven prototype. And here's a mystery. The first truck sold to Marston cost £475. The second, essentially identical, cost $4,900. Tenfold difference, same design, same capability. Nobody has ever produced an irrefutable explanation. The best theory is that Marston contributed to development costs and got a discount, or that Scammell gave him a reduced price in exchange for the right to sell the design to competitors, which would have been devastating for Marston's business advantage. Either way, 475 pounds for the world's largest lorry remains one of the great bargains in transport history. You couldn't buy a basic 40 hundredweight truck from Dennis or Albion for that price. So what did they actually build? The motive unit sat on a massive frame of riveted steel plates formed into a box section with apertures for the engine, transmission, and turntable. The engine was Scammell's own four-cylinder petrol unit, 7,094 cubic centimeters. In the standard Scammell range, this engine produced 80 brake horsepower. For the 100-tonner, they tuned it. The result was 86 brake horsepower, 6 extra horsepower. To move 100 additional tons? That's like taping a second hamster to the wheel and expecting to win a drag race. The fuel economy reflected this mismatch perfectly. 0.75 miles per gallon, 3/4 of a mile for every gallon of petrol burned. They fitted 3 fuel tanks with a combined capacity of 103 gallons, which theoretically gave the truck about 77 miles of range, on flat ground, with a tailwind, and optimism. In 1932, the original petrol engine was replaced by a Gardner 6 LW diesel. Power increased to 105 brake horsepower, and fuel economy improved to 4.2 miles per gallon. Still dreadful by any sane standard, but nearly 6 times better than the original. The Gardner diesel was one of the most reliable engines in British industry, known for running practically forever on minimal maintenance. It was the sensible choice, which made it unusual for a vehicle this fundamentally insensible. The transmission is where things got genuinely clever. The main gearbox was a standard Scammell 4-speed unit from the articulated 8-wheeler range. Power went from the gearbox through a telescopic shaft with Spicer universal joints to a central primary differential. This differential incorporated spur gears that doubled the available ratios to 8. Power then transferred to each of the 2 inline drive axles through roller chains, 2.5-inch pitch roller chains, adjustable by screwed radius rods. The primary differential handled left-right compensation for cornering, and each individual axle had its own differential for the same purpose on its pair of wheels. The gear ratios were changed by 2 levers, one mounted on each side of the chassis behind the cab. Each drive axle had to be changed independently, from outside the cab, while the vehicle was in motion, on a gradient, in northern England, in whatever weather northern England decided to provide, which was usually rain. The bottom ratio was 196 to 1. For comparison, a modern heavy truck might have a lowest ratio of around 14 to 1. At 196 to 1, the engine could be running at full speed while the truck barely moved, but it meant the 100-tonner could climb a 1 in 10 gradient fully loaded. Top speed in the highest gear was 5 to 6 miles per hour. Not exactly motorway material. Though to be fair, motorways didn't exist yet. Each drive axle had 2 wheels fitted with solid rubber tires, not pneumatic. Solid. 8-inch by 771 specification. The 4 driving wheels collectively bore 40 tons. The axles were located by forward mountings on a heavy cross tube and trailing arms that were ball-jointed to the rear corners of the chassis frame, allowing each axle to pivot and keep all 4 wheels squarely in contact with the ground. Rubber buffers absorbed vibration when running empty. The front axle was a massive double-cranked unit with a design loading of 8 tons. Screw and nut steering required 7 full turns of the cast steering wheel from lock to lock. No power steering. At maneuvering speeds, turning the wheel required what period sources diplomatically called considerable effort. And with 10 tons sitting on that axle under full load, considerable was an understatement. The cab had all the charm of a garden shed, a square wooden box with a windscreen. The originals had vertical windscreens, though KD 9168 later got sloping ones. Presumably an upgrade. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. Okay, back to it. The braking system had to stop 130 tons on roads made of crushed stone. 16-inch internal expanding transmission brakes were fitted to cross shafts from the primary differential, operated by either a foot pedal or a hand lever. The hand lever was a thoughtful addition. It freed both feet for throttle and clutch during hill starts, eliminating the need for wheel chocks. A separate hand wheel operated screw brakes directly on each drive wheel. But here's the thing. The trailer bogie also had brakes, and those were controlled not by the driver in front, but by the steersman sitting 78 feet behind him. They were connected by an Alfred Bell Admiralty-type telephonic communication system. The driver would call back and tell the steersman when to apply the bogie brakes. When the rear cabin needed to be removed for oversized loads, they switched to communicating by whistles. 2 men, 78 feet apart, one driving. One steering the back end manually with a ship's wheel-sized contraption, coordinating braking through voice commands on a telephone, on roads made for horses, in the 1930s. And people today complain about hands-free Bluetooth. The Carrier was a masterpiece of practical engineering. It came in 2 interchangeable configurations, 65-ton and 100-ton, the difference being additional axle sets that could be bolted on or removed depending on the job. The main structure used box girder side members attached to a riveted swan neck with a 3-foot diameter cross tube, providing the enormous strength needed at that junction. The Carrier connected to the tractor through a 6-inch ball joint. The rear axles were manually steerable through an enormous vertical wheel that looked like it belonged on a clipper ship. The steersman's accommodation evolved over time from a bare platform to a tiny, open-sided shelter, to a fully enclosed cabin with windows all round. Progress. Now, the road braking. This is what the title promised and the Scammell delivered. A 50-foot wheelbase, a gross weight exceeding 100 tons, road surfaces designed for horses and light carts, solid rubber tires that concentrated load into narrow contact patches instead of spreading it the way pneumatics would. Every journey was a potential disaster for the road surface. The drive wheels regularly punched straight through, sinking into the substrate below. This wasn't an occasional inconvenience. It was a predictable feature of every trip. Scammell's answer was a hydraulic jacking system fitted at the joint between carrier bed and swan neck. A hand-operated double-cylinder flywheel pump could raise the front of the Carrier by 15 inches, providing an extra 8 inches of ground clearance. The Carrier could also be lowered by 12 inches for tight overhead clearances. But the primary purpose was recovery. When the drive wheels sank through the road surface, the crew would jack the Carrier up onto bolsters, slide steel recovery plates under the trapped wheels, lower everything back down, and continue. They carried the steel plates as standard equipment on every journey. Because breaking through the road wasn't a question of if, it was when. Imagine being on the road maintenance crew for some rural council between Leeds and Liverpool in 1931, getting word that a 130-ton truck had just driven through your road. That was a real event that happened. Repeatedly. The first load KD 9168 carried wasn't actually a locomotive. It was a 25-ton, 56-foot launch built for the Royal Air Force by Harland and Wolff at their Bootle Works. Large crowds lined the 1.5-mile route to the Hornby area of Liverpool docks. In 1930, this was an event. People came out to watch, and the crowds became a recurring operational problem. For one critical delivery, a 99-ton prefabricated steel girder, Scammell built an exact scale model of the 100-tonner out of Meccano. Electrically powered, 1.25 inches to 1 foot, a fully detailed replica complete with a 16-wheel drawbar trailer. They used it to plan the route on a scale map, working out the correct steering lines for every corner, then chalked those lines onto the actual road surface so the driver and steersman would know exactly where to position the vehicle at each turn. Brilliant forward planning, one fatal flaw. By the time the real truck arrived, the enormous crowd that had assembled to watch had trampled every single chalk mark into oblivion. The delivery was completed anyway, though a steam engine was needed to winch the carrier sideways around some of the tighter corners. From 1943, KD 9168 settled into regular war work, hauling two 80-type locomotives from Newton-le-Willows to Gladstone Dock in Liverpool for the Ministry of Supply. Each loco weighed 75.5 tons, stretched nearly 38 feet long, stood over 14 feet high, and measured 10 feet 4 inches wide. Built by Vulcan Foundry, they were destined for Czechoslovakia, Poland, Yugoslavia, and Luxembourg. Over 80 of these locomotives were transported by 1946. Special tracks had to be laid at the dock for unloading, and Scammell Pioneer tractors from the Edward Box fleet were used to control each locomotive during the process. BLH-21 had its own character. Its first job was delivering a stone crusher to St. Austell in Cornwall. When they arrived, there was no crane to unload it, so they left the carrier as a permanent foundation for the machine. Scammell never built a replacement trailer, a 4,900-pound investment, abandoned in Cornwall as a glorified concrete pad. BLH-21 eventually passed through several owners, from Coley to Norman E. Box to Pickford's, and earned the nickname Leaping Lena. The reason was vivid. In drawbar configuration, when the driver applied power to pull away from a standstill, the torque reaction would rear the front end of the tractor straight up into the air. Front wheels completely off the ground, a 100-ton rated truck doing wheelies, not by design, just physics expressing itself. BLH-21 delivered the main structural girders for the Cumberland Hotel at Marble Arch in London. In December 1943, it transported 300-ton transformers rated at 242 kilovolts from BTH in Rugby to Manchester docks for export to Russia. Even double-headed with a steam traction engine for additional pulling power, that journey took 10 days through winter conditions. 10 days for roughly 120 miles. That's 12 miles a day, with two engines pulling. The heaviest load either truck ever carried was 165 tons. An ingot mold hauled in December 1935 by KD 9168 from Brightside Foundry in Sheffield to Vickers Works of the British Steel Corporation, also in Sheffield, 3 hours to load. The journey was completed at an average speed of 2 miles per hour. Gross train weight for that movement was somewhere around 220 tons, on roads built for horse carts, and then there was the whale, 85 tons, stranded. The historical records confirm it happened, but provide almost no detail beyond the weight and the fact that one of the 100-tonners carried it. How do you load an 85-ton whale onto a low loader? Where was the whale going? Was it being transported for scientific study, for public display? Who picked up the telephone at Pickford's and said, "We've got a whale situation. Can you send the 100-tonner?" History does not record this conversation, which is a genuine loss to the archives of British transport. It's worth noting there was technically a third Scammell 100-tonner, built entirely out of Meccano, at a scale of 1 1/4 inches to 1 foot, powered by electric motors. It was an exact replica of the full-sized vehicle, complete with a 16-wheel drawbar trailer. Scammell built it to plan the route for a particular load, a 99-ton prefabricated steel girder of enormous dimensions. The model was used on a scale map to determine the precise turning lines the real vehicle would need at every junction and corner. Once the correct paths were established, the route was marked with chalk on the actual roads. The Meccano model is one of the earliest known uses of scale simulation for heavy transport route planning. Today, we'd use computer modeling. In the 1930s, you built the truck out of Meccano and pushed it around a paper map. Same principle, different budget. Both trucks served continuously from 1930 until 1953. 23 years. During that entire span, no other manufacturer anywhere in the world produced a truck with genuine 100-ton carrying capacity from a single prime mover. It wasn't until the early 1950s that Foden and Pacific finally produced their own 100-ton rated vehicles. For more than 2 decades, KD 9168 and BLH-21 were the only 2 trucks on the planet that could do this job without doubling or tripling up on tractor units. Both survived. KD 9168 had an ownership journey that reads like a corporate genealogy of British heavy haulage. Marston Road Services was eventually bought by Edward Box, the Liverpool haulier, and KD was repainted in Box livery. Edward Box was then absorbed into Pickford's, one of Britain's oldest and most famous moving companies, with roots going back to the 17th century. So KD 9168 ended its working life wearing Pickford's colors, the most recognizable name in British haulage. After retirement in 1953, the truck was restored and rallied by Jack Hardwick of Ewell in Surrey. It spent over 30 years on display at the British Commercial Vehicle Museum in Leyland, Lancashire, where it became one of the most photographed exhibits. In 2018, it returned to the Hudson family. In 2022, it came up for sale through Ritchie Brothers. Dean Hudson, who'd grown up helping his father hand paint, polish, and restore it, described the experience with obvious affection. It still requires 3 people to crank it into action, nearly 100 years old. It still runs. Leaping Lena passed through Norman E. Box and Pickford's. Her trailer survived in the Pickford's fleet into the 1960s. 3 full decades past the tractor's own retirement. The motive unit ended up with Rush Green Motors in Hertfordshire. The story of the Scammell 100-tonner matters because it represents something that barely exists in engineering anymore. 2 men, given 8 months and essentially no precedent, designed and built a vehicle that quadrupled the capacity of anything their company had ever made. They did it with slide rules, riveted steel, roller chains, and a 4-cylinder petrol engine that wouldn't excite anyone today. They solved the problem of roads collapsing under the weight by carrying portable road surfaces. They solved the problem of a vehicle too long for one person to control by putting a second driver at the back with a telephone. They solved the problem of route planning by building a Meccano model and chalking lines on the road. Today, moving a 100-ton load is still specialized, but the tools are different. Modern heavy haulage tractors produce over 1,000 horsepower. Multi-axle modular trailers spread load across dozens of pneumatic tires. GPS replaces chalk marks. Radio replaces telephones. But the fundamental challenge is the same one Marston walked into Scammell's office with in 1929. Something enormous needs to move from here to there, and ordinary methods won't cut it. Scammell itself didn't survive the corporate consolidation of British industry. The company was absorbed into Leyland Motors in 1955. They continued building extraordinary vehicles, including the Commander tank transporter with its 625 horsepower Rolls-Royce 5512, which served in the Gulf War. But in 1987, DAF of Holland bought the Leyland Group and decided to close Watford. The factory shut in 1988. A company that started as a wheelwright in the East End, that built the world's biggest lorry when nobody thought it possible, that supplied tank transporters to the British Army for decades, was ultimately killed not by a competitor, but by an accountant's decision about factory consolidation. Nothing about it was elegant. The cab looked like a garden shed. The fuel economy was apocalyptic. The gear changes required leaving the vehicle. The roads shattered. The crowds destroyed the route markings. One trailer became a permanent rock crusher foundation in Cornwall, and once, for reasons nobody bothered to write down, they carried a whale. But it worked. Through the Depression, through a world war, through rationing, reconstruction, and the transformation of an entire country. 2 trucks, born in an age of horses and steam, did what nothing else on earth could do. And they kept doing it for 23 years. Oliver Danson North died in 1968 in Haslemere at 81. The Watford factory is gone, redeveloped, a piece of industrial history paved over. But the trucks remain, one in a museum, one in Hertfordshire, two wooden-cabbed, chain-driven, solid-tired machines from an era when the answer to every engineering problem was build it stronger and figure out the rest later. They were the biggest lorries ever built. They were the first of their kind. And for 23 years, they were the only ones. They still run. So that's the Scammell 100-tonner, a truck that needed a telephone to stop, broke every road it touched, and once hauled a whale for reasons lost to history. If you enjoyed this, subscribe. More coming soon.